Professor K here, and today we're going to be talking about functions, loops, and logic. Now, these are some kind of basic computer science programming principles that can be kind of hard to understand at first. So what I found really helpful when I was learning was just to get away from the computer for a few minutes, bring out my notebook or just a pen and paper, whatever you like writing on, and just really think about what it was I was trying to do with these. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate today. I'm going to show you how to think through what a loop actually does, and I'm going to demonstrate visually using pen and paper what the process is of a computer actually thinking through some of this logic. So with that, let's get started. All right, so here I have my fabulous iPad here, and what I've done is I've just kind of tried to put together a little bit of sample data and a little bit of output. So here I'm just going to pop onto my annotations layer and tell you a little bit about what I'm thinking this will do here. So here to the left, what I've circled here, this is going to be where I keep all of my data, right? So right now, I want to talk about Animal Crossing, and I want to do something with Animal Crossing animals. So I've got a group of animals here, a little collection of animals, and each of my animals has a name and a type. So in JavaScript, we would structure this as an object, and I'll show you more about what that looks like in JavaScript in the next video. But for now, just know that we've got kind of like a collection of related stuff here that we're going to be working with. Now you'll also notice this area down here that I haven't done anything with yet. I'll show you what that's for in a minute. Over to the right here, I'm going to have a working area where I'm just going to think through, what am I trying to do? And then at the bottom, I'm going to say, what happens? So that's a guide and just kind of an introduction to what the screen looks like here and how I'm going to be annotating. So let's just turn that off because we don't need that right now. The first thing that you should do whenever you're trying to tackle a computer science problem is just write out what your goal is. So here, my goal, I've decided, let me just switch onto my work layer here. My goal is to write the name of each Animal Crossing character. So I'm just going to write that down. So now that I know what my goal is, next I need to think about how I'm going to achieve that goal. And there are some keywords that we can use to help us understand what we might need to achieve that goal. So let's kind of look at some of those keywords here. First, of each is like a really great keyword here. That lets us know that we need some sort of loop to work through this problem. And then if we look at name here, what do we have over in our animals? We have a name piece of data. And remember that with objects in JavaScript, we talked a little bit about this in the document object model video. So if you haven't gone through that yet, take a quick look at that so that you can kind of get some familiarity with this syntax. One way that we could get to this name here is by saying animal.name, right? So those are some of the key basic concepts we're going to be working with here. How do we get to each name, right? How do we get to a name? And then how do we look at each of those animals? Okay, so let's get started here. In order to go through and keep track of how many animals we've actually worked through, so in order to keep track of which animal we're on here, we're going to need some sort of just way to keep track. I'm going to call this an iteration, right? We're going to say, okay, for each iteration of this loop, we're going to look at a different animal. So just to make that super clear, I'm going to write this in my work area, and I'm going to make a new type of data that will keep track of those iterations. So let's call this iteration. And I'm going to put in parentheses I, because you're going to see this abbreviated as I a lot in JavaScript. And every time we do an iteration, all we're going to do is just kind of go back, and just like we were tallying something up on a board, we're just going to mark it down. So let's kind of pop over here, and we're just going to, like, each time we go through, just like, remember how you might do this sort of thing? That's how we're going to keep track of where we're at in our logic. All right. So let's get started. Now that we've got an idea of what we need to do, let's actually work through this problem. So and then I'm going to write just some stuff in a different color here so that you can see what it means. Each Animal Crossing character. And then we're just going to set this back up here. And we don't have to know exactly how to write this orange part in JavaScript yet. We're just kind of getting a sense of what this might look like in code. Remember, you always need your curly brackets, and we're just going to add an end curly bracket right there. And remember how we used console.log in our previous videos to actually show the output of something? We're going to do that here. We're going to say console.log in parentheses, and I'm going to end that with a semicolon. I'm just going to go right back to that orange because we don't know quite what this looks like here. We're going to put this as animal's name. So this is called pseudocoding. It's just kind of writing out in really light terms, not worrying too much about the syntax, and putting it in a way that you understand code that won't work when you actually run it, but that will help you understand what you need to do to break down the problem. So here we've got two problems we need to solve to get this loop working. We need to figure out how to do this each Animal Crossing character piece, and then we need to also figure out how to get to the animal's name. All right, so let's start with this piece here. And we're going to start with a really simple way of going about this. We are going to just try and work out a really simple for loop. So remember how we needed some sort of way to keep track of where we're at? In JavaScript, this looks like an I. All right. So over here, we have our data for animals and we have our data for I. How do you create data in JavaScript? How do you create a place to store your data? Think back on our last videos, right? And take a guess about what you might need here. Pause the video if you need to at this point. You got an idea? Awesome. If you said that you need let or const or some sort of variable to store data, you'd be absolutely right. So right now we're going to use let. And the reason why we're going to use let is because over here in iteration, we're making marks down each time. So the value is going to keep changing. That means that let is the correct way to go here. If we did const, it would never change. We would never be able to keep track of where we were at. And variable is just not good practice. So we can rule that out right away. All right, so let's take this out and let's just start writing this for loop here. Real simple. And I'm going to take out this. And I'm just going to show you what you'll put in in code to make this happen. So for let I is going to be our iteration here, equals 0. So why do we start at 0? Well, because we haven't actually done any iterations yet, right? We haven't done anything here yet. There's no marks. There's none of these, right? So why would you start it at 1 or something like that? We haven't actually gone through an iteration. So at the very beginning of this, you're always going to start at 0. And that's a really important computer science concept to understand, is your first, generally when you start things, they start at 0. So for let I equals 0. Now when do we stop? When do we want to stop running this code? We have to think about this for a second. So here, I'm just going to turn back on my annotations and let's think about this for a second. We only have 1, 2, 3 animals here. And down here in iterations, if we never say when to stop, we could be going on like this forever and ever and ever, right? We don't want that. We want to stop looking at this when this is a certain value. Think about this and just try to reason through it. When would you want this to stop? You'd want to stop it when it runs out of animals, right? So how can we figure out how many animals we have? Well, the way to do this is to ask animals here, how many animals are there? And the way that you do that with an object or an array in JavaScript is generally called .length. So for let I equals 0, I is going to be, we want this to stop when I is less than the total amount of animals. So we want this to keep running when we're still less than the total amount of animals. That's going to be animals, whoops, spelled that wrong. Animals. And then .length. Let me just neaten up my writing there. Length, semicolon each time, and we're gonna move this over just for a second because we're not quite done here. Now there's one more piece that we're missing here. So we've said what our iteration is. We've said when this should stop, but how are we actually when are we actually keeping track? When are we actually making this mark down in iteration, right? So the last piece of a for loop is this very final variable. We're going to add 1 each time the loop runs. And the way that you do that is by saying I plus plus, semicolon. So remember last videos when we talked about incrementing, decrementing, we talked about all those different ways to modify variables. See how that shorthand plus plus comes in really important here? It's really handy. So you'll see this pattern in for loops all the time. And if we wanted to test this right now, we could just comment out this console.log, and we could say instead console.log the value of I. And this might be a good way to understand how the for loop is running. So let's now take a moment to take a look at exactly what would happen if we ran this code right this moment. And I'm going to use green to show what would happen at runtime. Okay, so for right now, we are going to ignore this console.log statement. This here, the // is a comment, so we don't have to worry about it. Okay, so in this loop, I is going to be equal to 0. So let me just say, okay, we've made this variable happen. I exists. And we have no iterations yet. While this is happening, we're going to check that I, this data here, is less than the amount of these animals.length. And then we're going to say each time this loop ends, right over here, we're going to add 1 to I. So now we've kind of set the stage in the for loop, and we're over here, and we're going to really focus our efforts in here. So that middle block where we actually have the instructions is where we're going to execute this code and where we're going to go through that pattern. All right, so let's take away these annotations for a moment and just start working through this. Okay, so first iteration is 0. And we always start inside the block and end inside the block when going through our output. So our first output is going to be console.log the value of I. Right now, I is 0. So here we are going to put 0 in our output. That's the first run. First run. Okay, so now, easy peasy. At the end, this says we're going to increment I plus plus. So now this I plus plus is going to put down 1 in the iteration. It's like 1 in the tally box. We're going to go back up to the beginning of this. We're going to skip this console.log animal's name again. And now we're going to do console.log I. So now we see, okay, I'm going to look over iteration I here. I've got 1 in the tally box. So now, at our second run, I is going to be 1. Remember that at the end, we bounce back up here, I plus plus. 1 more checkbox in the iteration. Getting the hang of it, right? All right, so going at the beginning, I skipped a step here. I just realized I haven't been checking animals.length. So here, right at this point, at this beginning point, we are going to look at whether I is less than animals.length. So animals.length is 3. And right now, I is 2, right? We're going to look down here, see that it's 2 in iteration. And animals is 3. So we can go ahead and continue with this loop. Here, we console.log I, 2, third run, and then I plus plus, 3. Okay, so finally, one last time, we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to check what I is. I needs to be less, ooh, I wrote this wrong. I needs to be less than animals.length. Let me fix that up here. You know, I would have realized this pretty quick if I had actually gone and run this in code. So I is less than, make sure you're always using the right direction of brackets here. Okay, so I needs to be less than animals.length. Well, okay, is 3 less than 3? No, it's equal to. So here we stop. We're like, okay, we're done. All done. So our final output is going to be 0, 1, and 2 for the whole thing. Cool, right? So that's a whole lot of work to get just a couple of things to output to our console.log. What we really want is the animal's name here. So let's back up a little bit and kind of get back to where we were at now that we understand how loops work. And we're going to go back to our work layer here and remove this console.log I. And now we're going to think about how can we get animal's name. So here are our animals and here's the name. Now each of these animals is at a certain place. Brewster, Isabel, and Pascal here all have a position. They're all kind of lined up in this array. So in our animals array, every array starts at position 0. Everything you start in computer science starts at position 0. So here, if we were to label what position each of these animals were at, here Isabel would be at 0. Brewster would be at 1, and Pascal would be at 2. Is this starting to look familiar? Are you starting to see why our iteration I might be really helpful here? How could we get to an animal's name using this information? Pause here if you want. Go take a look at arrays and maybe do some Googling about how to get to a specific place in an array and see if you can figure this out. All right, so if you came back and you said, oh, well, I would look at animals, right? And I would look at the position using a bracket, and then maybe 0, and then use dot notation to get to name, you would be absolutely right. So if we were to console.log right now, animals at 0, dot name, we would get Isabel. That's exactly what would show up there. Now think about what would happen if we did, instead of this, instead of 0, we did animals at 1. What would log out? Brewster, right? And why does that happen? Because Brewster here is at position 1. And you can keep going like that. Here, Pascal is at 2. So, knowing what we know now, let's back up a little bit and say, okay, how do we get to that animal's name? We're going to use this animals at some position dot name. So let's take what we've learned here. And this is really breaking down for loops, like in a real, very kind of step-by-step way. So you're eventually going to learn how to do this and learn the syntax, and it'll be like second nature to you. But if you really want to understand how a for loop is working, this is the video for that. All right, so let's uncomment our console log here, and let's add what we just learned. To get the animal name, right, the name of each Animal Crossing character, that's our goal here, we are going to put animals dot, oops, not even dot, brackets, right? Because we want the position in the array. We want some sort of position. Now think about this. If we wanted Isabel at 0, Brewster at 1, and Pascal at 2, what have we been using so far that might give us that number? Think about it for a second. Think about what we just console logged out in as we were trying to figure out how this for loop works. Got any ideas? Well, if you said that, aren't we keeping track of that with I? Isn't that what iteration over here is? You would be absolutely right. We are, in fact, keeping track of this in our tally box over here in iteration. So what's really handy about the I variable in for loops, and you can name it anything you want, but I for iteration really is kind of standard practice among the industry. What that's going to do is let you say magically over here, let's use orange here because it's a little easier to see. If you use I, it's always going to look at the tally and then go grab the animal that you want. So really, really handy. All right, so let's, now that we know what we're doing, make that a real thing, I. And then dot name, again, we're going to be using that dot notation. All right, so here, finally, we've achieved our goal. Write the name of each Animal Crossing character to the log. And now I want to go through, and one last time, let's test this. Let's see what would happen if we ran this right now. So I am going to work through the loop one more time. And we are going to use, let's use blue to work through the loop. All right, so here is our loop. Remember, when we start the loop, we set some rules up, right? We say that we are going to make a data piece to keep track of, to tally up how many times we've gone through this loop, iteration or I. So that's that first piece, right? Say what iteration is. This second piece is to say how long to keep running the loop. Here, until as long as I is less than animals.length, we can keep going. So that'll be the first condition we check, and we're always going to check it. Let's even like make this really clear by using a red here. We're going to check this condition at this point. And then we're going to work on this last piece, this I++, at the end. So when we know that we're good to go, let's use a nice dark green here. We'll do an I++, and that will happen here. And in the meantime, in the middle, we will run our console.log statement out to the log. All right, so let's start. Here we're going to run our loop, and firstly, we are going to say I is 0. Yep, iteration is 0, haven't done anything. And then we're going to start with this red piece here. So at this point, we are going to check if I is less than animals.length. How long is animals? 3. So down here, iteration is 0. You know what I did? This didn't work because I forgot to change this back to a less than. So let's make sure I is less than animals.length. And we see that our iteration here is 0. 3 is our length, right? Up from animals. So we can go ahead and continue on with the loop. So now let's go to our console.log statement. Here we are going to console.log animals at this I value. So what's the I value right now? Let's look at iteration. 0. Nothing's there yet. We haven't actually gone through a full iteration of this loop. So who's at 0? Isabel is. And we know that because of this notation here. So we would take a look at Isabel at 0 and the name at 0. So here is our name. And that means our output is going to be Isabel. And this is going to be first run. All right. So let's go through that one more time. Next, we're going to take a look. Oh, you know what? You know what we haven't done yet? We haven't completed the loop. We haven't done the green part yet. So now, under iterations, we're going to do one mark. All right. So here we go. Back up to the top here. Back up to this red. What's I right now? 1. Is I less than animals.length? 3? Yes. Go ahead and continue. Let's switch to our console.log statement. Console.log, that means go to your output here. Animals at I. What's animals at I? Brewster. And we're going to look at specific. So here, it's going to output Brewster to the console. Second run. Okay, now that we're done with that, we switch to that last piece, this last statement, I++. Mark down one more iteration. Back up to our red here. We're going to check that I is less than animals.length. How much is I? 2. How much is animals.length? 3. 2 is less than 3. Keep going. All right, we're ready to go on back to our console log. And again, we're going to take a look at animals at I. Remember, I is 2. So this is Pascal. And we're just going to log out the name, Pascal. Third run. Okay, now that we've done that, we are ready to move on to our final statement here, I++. Mark down one more in the tally. Go back up, and finally, we are going to check one last time. Is I less than animals.length? I iteration is 3, and animals.length is 3. So 3 is not less than 3, it's the same. So now, finally, we stop. We're good. We finally got through it. And here, we have logged out what our goal was, right? Our ultimate goal was write the name of each Animal Crossing character to the log, and we've got it. It's now in our output. So that's an in-depth look at how these loops work, right? That's going to give you all of the basics for how a for loop works. So I realized that was a lot of information at once. That's really the theory behind things. Now, when you hear about for loops, hopefully you'll understand that exactly how they work and why they're working and what that code pattern looks like. So now that you know that, now that you kind of know exactly how this is working, we're going to take a closer look at how to do this in real code and what it goes through looking like. So that'll be a faster video. I'll kind of go over the basics of this, but we'll be going through, okay, well, what are some of the differences between different types of loops and logic and how they work? So stick with us. We'll see that in just a moment. I'll see you later.